In the history of how nations fall, defeat usually announces itself loudly through engines, artillery, and collapsing front lines. But in 1956, the decisive blow against the British Empire arrived without noise. No explosions, no surrender ceremony. It crossed the Atlantic without a single shot being fired. British paratroopers dropped near Port Said. Royal Navy ships moved toward the Suez Canal. On the battlefield, the operation was unfolding as planned. Militarily, Britain was winning. And then a message arrived from Washington. It did not demand land. It did not threaten force. It did not even argue legality. It spoke only of money. The United States made its position clear. If Britain continued the operation, American financial support would end, the dollar lifeline would be cut. The pound sterling would be left to face global markets alone. Inside Whitehall, the effect was immediate. Treasury officials froze. Bank of England governors began emergency calculations. Cabinet ministers realized the threat was not hypothetical. For the first time, a major power confronted an enemy with no army and no navy, only liquidity. And slowly, a brutal truth emerged. This war would not be lost in Egypt. It would be lost in London. By the time that message landed, the British pound was already living on borrowed credibility. On the surface, it still carried imperial authority. Sterling circulated across the Commonwealth. London remained a global financial hub. Public statements projected confidence, as if Britain still stood at the center of the world economy. But beneath that image was a different reality. The Second World War had exhausted Britain's finances. Gold reserves were depleted. Overseas assets had been sold to pay for survival. The empire no longer generated enough surplus to sustain the currency that symbolized it. What remained was debt. The Bretton Woods system locked this weakness into place. Under the new order, currencies were pegged to the US dollar, and the dollar alone was convertible into gold. Britain could maintain the pound's value only by spending its dollar reserves to defend it in foreign exchange markets. Sterling was not sovereign, it was conditional. Every tremor of instability forced the same response. Sell dollars, buy pounds, and hope confidence returned. But confidence was no longer political. It was numerical, and the numbers were unforgiving. Britain's dollar reserves were thin, alarmingly thin. Treasury memoranda warned of it. Bank of England officials flagged it repeatedly. Yet publicly, the illusion was preserved. The pound was described as strong, stable, independent. In reality, it was trapped inside a golden cage, held together not by British power, but by American tolerance. That tolerance might have lasted, if not for the Suez Canal. The canal was not merely a strategic shortcut. It was the central artery of Britain's post-war economy. Nearly two-thirds of Europe's oil passed through it, and almost all of that oil was purchased in US dollars. Every tanker moving through Suez carried energy, but also financial stability. As long as the canal flowed freely, Britain's dollar shortage remained manageable. If it was disrupted, the arithmetic turned merciless. This was the pound's Achilles heel. Without Suez, oil shipments were forced around the Cape of Good Hope, adding thousands of miles to each journey. Transport costs surged, insurance premiums spiked, and every additional mile translated into more dollars draining from Britain's reserves. Global markets understood this instantly. A Britain cut off from Suez was a Britain bleeding dollars faster than it could replace them. The canal became more than a geopolitical prize. It became a financial fault line. And the moment Britain chose military force to secure it, that fault line began to shift, quietly, invisibly, inside the currency itself, setting the stage for a confrontation that would no longer be about territory, but survival. Gamal Abdel Nasser was Egypt's new kind of leader, a young army officer turned president shaped by colonial humiliation and post-war ambition. For Nasser, the Suez Canal was never just infrastructure. It was the last visible scar of foreign control. Since the 19th century, the canal had been owned and operated by a company headquartered in Europe, staffed largely by foreigners and protected, directly or indirectly, by British power. Egypt hosted it, guarded it, and depended on it, but did not truly control it. Even after formal independence, British troops remained on Egyptian soil, and canal revenues flowed outward. Nasser viewed this arrangement as unfinished decolonization. He also understood the financial dimension with unusual clarity. Egypt needed capital to modernize: dams, factories, electricity. Western loans had come with political conditions. When the United States and Britain withdrew funding for the Aswan High Dam, Nasser saw the limits of dependency exposed. The response was calculated. In July 1956, Nasser announced the nationalization of the Suez Canal Company. Canal tolls would be collected by Egypt. Compensation would be paid to shareholders, but control would shift permanently. The revenue would fund development without foreign leverage. This was not an impulsive gesture. It was a strategic financial gamble. Nasser assumed Britain and France would rage, but hesitate. Both were constrained by weakened currencies, fragile reserves, and a global financial system they no longer dominated. He believed they could threaten force, but not sustain the economic consequences of using it. In that calculation, the canal became more than a symbol. It became leverage. By seizing it, Nasser was not daring Britain to fight. He was daring Britain to pay. And as London prepared its response, the confrontation began to move away from speeches and troop movements toward a quieter arena where confidence, credit, and currency would matter more than firepower. Anthony Eden was Britain's prime minister, but more importantly, he was an imperial veteran. A man formed in the age when British power in the Middle East went unquestioned. Eden did not see the Suez Canal the way Nasser did. For him, it was not leverage, it was loss. Eden had built his career during the age of empire, when British authority in the Middle East was assumed, not debated. He had negotiated with dictators, managed crises, and watched Britain project power across continents. To him, Nasser was not a nationalist reformer. He was a reckless upstart, challenging an order Eden believed still existed, and that belief shaped everything that followed. Inside Whitehall, warnings accumulated. Treasury officials emphasized the fragility of sterling. Bank of England governors cautioned that reserves could not withstand sustained pressure. American intentions were uncertain at best. All of it was documented. All of it was delivered. Eden dismissed the financial risk. He framed the crisis as moral and political, not economic. He spoke of credibility, prestige, and deterrence. To back down, he believed, would invite collapse elsewhere, in Jordan, in the Gulf, across the remnants of empire. But this was projection, not calculation. Eden's health was failing. His temper was short. He saw Nasser through the lens of 1930s Europe, comparing him openly to Hitler. That analogy narrowed his options. Appeasement in Eden's mind was impossible. The result was tunnel vision. Economic realities became secondary. Currency exposure became abstract. The idea that Britain could be defeated without a battle seemed inconceivable to a man shaped by war. And so, while bankers counted dollars and markets watched nervously, the Prime Minister focused on restoring authority, convinced that decisive action would resolve the crisis before the numbers had time to matter. It was a fatal misreading of the world Britain now inhabited, one where power no longer rested solely in armies or flags, but in balance sheets Britain no longer controlled. As public diplomacy stalled, Britain shifted into the shadows. What followed was not a spontaneous invasion, but a coordinated design. Britain and France, both furious at the loss of the Suez Canal, began secret discussions with Israel. The logic was carefully staged. Israel would move first into the Sinai. Britain and France would then issue an ultimatum to both sides, demanding a withdrawal from the canal zone. When Egypt refused, Anglo-French forces would intervene, appearing not as aggressors but as peacekeepers. On paper, it was elegant. It restored control of the canal. It humiliated Nasser. And it preserved the illusion of legitimacy. But the plan rested on a fatal assumption, that the United States would tolerate it. British leaders believed Washington would protest publicly, then quietly support them once events were irreversible. They assumed shared alliances, Cold War priorities, and historical partnership would outweigh economic objections. They were wrong. What London misread was not American anger, but American leverage. The United States did not need troops to stop the invasion. It did not need sanctions or force. It needed only to step aside, to refuse financial support, to withhold dollars, to let the market do the rest. And as the operation moved from secrecy to action, the consequences of that miscalculation began to surface, not in Cairo or Sinai, but in currency markets that were already watching Britain with growing doubt. The moment the operation began, the markets reacted, not to the movement of troops, but to the risk they represented. As news broke of Israeli forces entering the Sinai, traders in New York and Europe recalculated instantly. Britain was at war over the Suez Canal, and the question was no longer political. It was financial. Confidence in the pound sterling weakened within hours. Orders to sell began quietly, then multiplied. Banks shifted positions. Funds moved out of sterling and into dollars, the safest asset in a crisis. In London, the reaction was immediate. Dealers watched screens flicker as the pound came under pressure. Each dip triggered further selling. The Bank of England intervened, buying sterling to slow the fall, burning through dollar reserves to project stability. But stability required belief, and belief was evaporating. Rumors spread faster than facts. Would the United States support Britain? Would the International Monetary Fund intervene? Was the war expanding or ending? Every unanswered question translated into another transaction. By the end of the first day, it was clear this was not a battlefield crisis. It was a currency run. The pound was being tested in real time by global markets that no longer trusted British assurances. Inside the Treasury, emergency meetings ran late into the night. Spreadsheets replaced maps. Exchange rates replaced troop movements. The invasion was advancing. But in the financial heart of London, a different front had opened, one where speed, not strength, would decide the outcome. By the second day, the pattern was unmistakable. The Bank of England was no longer managing volatility. It was fighting survival. Every hour, dealers demanded dollars in exchange for pounds. To defend the fixed exchange rate, the bank had only one option: sell its reserves. Gold was gone long ago. What remained were dollars, accumulated slowly and guarded obsessively. Now they were disappearing. Officials authorized intervention after intervention. Millions turned into hundreds of millions. Each transaction bought minutes of calm, followed by another wave of selling. The market was not irrational, it was doing the math. Britain was importing oil at rising costs. Shipping routes were longer. Insurance premiums were exploding. War spending was accelerating. And American support was conspicuously absent. The reserves began to bleed. Inside the Treasury, the metaphor was unavoidable. The pound was a damaged ship, taking on water faster than it could be pumped out. Every attempt to stabilize it required sacrificing more of the hull. Numbers on ledgers fell with terrifying speed. Dollar holdings dropped from billions toward levels that triggered panic protocols. Emergency calls went out to New York banks, to international partners, to anyone who might provide temporary relief. But relief depended on confidence, and confidence depended on Washington. Markets watched carefully. They saw no reassuring signals, no statements, no intervention, only silence. That silence was interpreted as permission. By midweek, the defense of sterling was no longer sustainable. Each dollar spent made the next attack more likely. Each hour of resistance weakened Britain's position further. The question inside Whitehall was no longer whether the pound could be saved. It was how much would be left when the defense finally failed, and whether anyone would step in before the damage became irreversible. By the end of the week, Britain had run out of options. With reserves collapsing and markets circling, the government turned to the only institution large enough to stop the panic: the International Monetary Fund. The request was urgent: a $1.3 billion emergency credit line. Enough dollars to stabilize the pound, enough time to regain control. But the IMF was not independent. Behind it stood the United States. In Washington, President Dwight Eisenhower viewed the crisis through a different lens. This was not about the canal, it was about discipline, about preventing old empires from dragging the world into chaos. The decision was swift. The United States would not support the loan. No public confrontation, no dramatic announcement, just refusal. Without American backing, the IMF could not act. And without the IMF, Britain had no shield left. The markets understood immediately what that silence meant. The final line of defense had vanished. What remained was a currency exposed to the full force of global selling pressure, and a government facing a choice that no amount of military success could undo. With its reserves nearly exhausted, Britain faced a reality it could no longer avoid. Another day of intervention would mean total collapse. The pound would break, imports would halt, the economy would seize. Inside the cabinet, the logic was brutal and immediate. The military operation was ordered to stop. British forces had not been defeated on the ground. They held positions. They controlled objectives. But none of it mattered. Without a currency, there was no way to continue. The withdrawal was announced quietly. Orders were reversed. Allies were informed. For the first time in history, a major military campaign ended not because of battlefield failure, but because the money ran out. The bank had overruled the army, and the consequences of that decision were only beginning to spread. The withdrawal from Suez marked more than a political humiliation. It confirmed a new global order. Until that moment, the British pound had survived on history and habit. It was still used in trade, still held by central banks, still treated as a pillar of the international system. But after Suez, that confidence never fully returned. What the crisis exposed was simple. Ultimate power no longer belonged to empires with fleets, but to states that controlled liquidity. The United States did not fire a shot. It did not seize territory. Yet it determined the outcome by deciding which currency would be supported and which would not. From that point forward, the dollar's position was no longer theoretical. It became the world's undisputed reserve currency. Oil, trade, debt, and reconstruction flowed through it. Financial institutions aligned around it. Political influence followed naturally. The pound did not collapse overnight. It lingered. It adjusted. But its role was permanently diminished. Suez demonstrated with brutal clarity that monetary dominance had replaced imperial reach as the foundation of global power, and that this new hierarchy would be enforced quietly through markets rather than armies. Suez revealed a truth that modern geopolitics still struggles to accept. Sovereignty is not defined by flags or borders. It is defined by solvency. Britain had an army. It had allies. It had global reach. But it did not control the currency it depended on, and that dependency proved fatal. In the modern world, power does not always announce itself through force. It operates through exchange rates, reserve holdings, and access to liquidity. A nation can win battles and still lose wars if its money is vulnerable. Currency is not just a medium of trade. It is a weapon. And those who rely on it without controlling it eventually discover that the most decisive conflicts are fought not with soldiers, but with numbers. The Suez Crisis did not end in 1956. It changed form. The battlefield moved from canals to shipping lanes, from colonial assets to debt markets, from invasion plans to balance sheets. Nations no longer need to be occupied to be constrained. They only need to be indebted, dependent, or exposed. Today, the same logic repeats itself in quieter ways. Control over trade routes, energy choke points, and financial infrastructure determines outcomes long before diplomats speak. Access to dollars, credit lines, and payment systems can decide the fate of governments without a single shot being fired. The pattern is consistent. Those who understand currency wield influence without confrontation. Those who ignore it discover limits too late. Suez was the moment this reality became undeniable. Not because Britain lost territory, but because it lost financial autonomy. And the question that crisis leaves behind is not historical, it is contemporary. Who controls the money, and who merely depends on it? Because in the modern world, that answer still decides who wins.